Welcome to the latest episode of Sports Bazaar and the last episode in our America's Cup deep dive. It's been fascinating to date, but what better way to finish it off than going to the source itself and in celebrating 40 years since a famous victory, possibly the most famous moment in Australian sport. What better way to do it than with myself, Titus O'Reilly. And Titus, you've brought a special guest.
Well, we have none other than John Bertrand, the actual skipper of Australia 2 in 1983. And I've just I'd read it a long time ago, but part of our research, I'd read your book, Born to Win, John, which is so popular. In 2020, it got returned to a Townsville library. Have you heard this story?
I have, actually.
After 30 years overdue, and it had been handed from yacht to yacht on westward journeys. It had gone around the entire world, hadn't it, before it came back?
It's pretty cool, I think. Yeah, and it still survived.
Just surprised to learn there's a library in Townsville, but there you go.
Now, John, you're reading your book and coming back to it. One thing that's amazing, and it will be for our listeners who have gone through the whole series with us right back to the start, is this America's Cup runs in your family's blood going back a fair way. Your great-grandfather, perhaps you could tell us a bit about him and his involvement with the America's Cup.
Well, according to my grandmother, my great-grandfather, Thomas Perks, in Southampton, that's where they lived and grew up. He was involved in 3 of Sir Thomas Lipton's J-class America's Cup challenging yachts. In terms of construction, he was an engineer, and the Scottish engineers, who were considered the best, that there were, came down and stayed at my great grandfather's home in Southampton, and each boat, basically 9-month to 12-month build. So 3 America's Cup boats, the Shamrocks, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, one of those. Yeah. So actually, the title of the book came from that in terms of initially it was going to be called To Take You Home, which is an extract within Jonathan Livingston's Seagull. Richard Buck was the author, and the Bantam Books over in New York decided that wasn't a so-called pick-me-up title. It wasn't, didn't jump off the shelf. And they said, what's different about this bloke? And then they looked at my ancestry and saw Thomas Perks was heavily involved and said, hey, this kid's born to win, it's part of the lineage, you might say.
Yeah.
And, so there's plenty of salt in, I guess, my veins, yeah.
And you grew up in Melbourne, right on the beach, basically.
Yeah, you've got to have a bit of luck in life, and we grew up, my brother and I grew up in a house which Mum and Dad rented down at Chelsea, outside of Melbourne, and we climb over the side fence, not the back fence, because the property went along the beach, over the side fence, and we're onto Chelsea Beach, and about a kilometre along the beach was a little club called the Chelsea Yacht Club. So we used to hang out there, and it was kind of our kindergarten. We'd sort of be up in the rafters and listen to the old blokes, dirty jokes, while they were putting a VB around the 44-gallon drum with a Coke in it, in terms of, fire and whatever.
Yeah.
And, our memories, we'd muck around with boats in summertime, play footy in winter, and try and do a bit of schoolwork in between. Yeah.
What was your first boat, John?
Oh, look, anything we could borrow. It was actually a fishing boat that we put a square rig sail on. Mum bought a parachute from the army disposal and cut it up into a big a sail. We used to paddle this fishing boat out to sea and then turn around and then sail back in. We just thought it was unbelievable, watching the bubbles go past, and I was 6 or 7 years old at the time, yeah.
And your brother and you both would do this together, and I read that you said that you and him, when you fought over who could have the tiller, who could steer, and it had to be resolved with a family meeting.
Well, Dad, he died when we were 15. We didn't have any money. He died when we were 15, when I was 15, and we didn't have enough money for the funeral, so it's kind of interesting, but it didn't matter. We didn't consider ourselves poor. It's just the way it was. But, Mum recalls the story of the fighting was so bad. We had a little Sabo, 80-foot dinghy training boat, that Dad had the axe poised above his head to cut the bastard in two. You know? So Mum stopped him from chopping it in two with frustration of these two boys fighting all the time. And in fact, we built a second boat so we could both steer our own boat.
Oh, right. You just went the whole hole.
It's a type of conflict that would put you in good stead with the New York Yacht Club many years later and some of the legal wrangling around that.
Getting battle hardened, that's right. Yeah.
Indeed.
You were then sailing competitively a lot. When did you start to think, oh, this is going to be something I'll always do? I'm going to take this quite seriously.
Well, initially, I didn't like the competition. In fact, in hindsight, I was highly competitive. I didn't realize at the time, but I used to get very nervous. And, in school sports, I remember almost vomiting. I was a reasonable sprinter, and I remember I can still smell the cut grass in preparation for, the 100-meter or 100-yard sprint in those days at state school. And in the sailing, it was the same thing. I loved cruising around and sailing, but not really competition. But it was really when I was, I guess, 13 or 14 that I started to really start to enjoy the sense of competition. And that sort of led to winning national championships in different classes and ultimately Olympic Games and America's Cup, a whole bunch of stuff.
And so this is when the Australians sort of started to get into the America's Cup. Frank Packer was starting to fund challenges for it. And you were at university, weren't you? Even at uni, you were getting. So it sort of reads like you were planning your whole life to become the America's Cup winning skipper. What was your thesis at university?
Well, first of all, let me say I met my future wife when I was 18 and Raza was 17. And she reckons she married a boring engineer with potential. Right? So at Monash University, which is when we're going out, okay, my thesis was the optimum angle of attack of America's Cup sails.
That's some good pillow talk you've got there, John.
My God,
Let me tell you.
You just imagine it, yeah.
So you were going deep early. You were really getting into this. And you were following...
That's a plan, though, isn't it? That's you are already have identified what it is you want to do down the track, haven't you?
Yeah, that's right. Correct. I had this fascination for, technology, boring engineering background, but also the concept of the United States. The America's Cup was a great fascination. It was a Everest of sport. And like so many people in that era, we listened on the wireless, not the radio, the wireless, Gretel 1, which was Frank Packer's boat. Old Man Packer was the middleweight boxing champion of Australia during the Depression. So he was a tough old bastard, that bloke, And he was the first to challenge for the America's Cup. And I remember listening on the wireless, Gretel 1 surfing past a boat called Wetterly to win one of the races. And that was way back in 1962. So that fired my imagination. I remember.
And that was the first time someone had won a race since the 30s, I think, in the America's Cup. So that was a big deal to even just, not just beating the Americans was a huge deal, but just winning a race against them was seen as a big deal there.
Yeah, and Gretel 1, 1962, was using an American-made spinnaker. It's the big sail that goes out front. So the New York Yacht Club, bless them, decided that as a result of that, any challenging nation has to create their own sailcloth.
Yeah.
So Benny Lexcen, and we'll talk about Benny, I'm sure.
Yeah, we will.
Yes, we will.
Benny said, if we ever win that damn thing, very colourful language, he said, all sailcloth for the future for the challengers has to be made out of kangaroo hide. So, but the New York Yacht Club interpreted the so-called deed of gift over many different iterations.
Yeah.
And part of it is that from then on, we had to create our own sailcloth.
They always interpret it, funnily enough, in their favour, often the deed of
after
gift.
The facts. After the facts. They had a real talent for it, didn't they?
Well, I tell people, having lived in the US and, for quite a few years over the time, that Americans will eat their grandmother if required.
Right.
They are competitive
Yeah.
people. And the concept of losing the America's Cup, it started off, as you well know, before the US Civil War. And the Americans successfully defended over that period of time. It was untouchable by any nation. And they did everything, it's just part of what they were. They'd interpret it any way they liked to make sure that that they went into battle with a very strong game plan and an upper hand.
Mm.
Yep.
And then you were actually asked to join one of Frank Packer's boats, but your mum didn't let you go. Is that true?
No.
Not quite?
No. Well, I'm just trying to think now. This was 1970, so the first.
I think she suggested you finish uni first.
Yeah, well, that's actually true. You're right. Yeah, thinking back on it, Mum was pretty tough.
Yeah. So you were desperate to go, but she was like, finish your degree.
That's correct, yeah. So 62 was the first America's Cup. That was Frank Packer. Then 67, Dame Patty. Then 1970, Gretel 2. That was, again, Frank Packer.
Yeah.
And, yes, I was asked to, come on board and be part of the team for the 1970 America's Cup. And I was finishing off final year at Monash University. So I was able – anyway, the thesis topped the University of Engineering.
Yeah.
And I wasn't an academic student, but, I just got locked into it, loved it.
Yeah.
Just asked my wife to be, and that's the reality of it. And went up to Sydney, tried out on a boat, went across the US, got hammered again by the Yanks.
Yeah.
We won one race, but, who cares?
That's when you started to realise how competitive they were?
Oh, yeah.
That was where you realised the lengths you'd need to go to?
It was just another world. The US Navy, the US Coast Guard, NASA, aerospace technology, all of that stuff thrown at these US defenders.
Yeah.
Fronting up, it's just another world. The enormity of the US of A, the most powerful nation in the world then and still are. And for a little country like Australia where, Aussies from down under, it's just like lambs to slaughter. And
you're sailing their waters too. So they've got they've literally got home field advantage.
Yeah, got everything sorted. Yeah. So,
John,
hail fellow, well met, but they'll kill you if required. yeah.
John, can I ask, what's in it for someone like Frank Packer? Because it then goes on to be Alan Bond, and it then seems to be the succession of very wealthy men who have an itch to scratch or some need to do this. For Australia, for themselves, what's their motive? What do they get out of this?
Well, with Frank Old Man Packer, I think it was really, to take on this. These people are different. Packer, Bond, these characters. Sparrow and Bick, France, he challenged unsuccessfully 5 times. Sir Thomas Lipton, unsuccessful 5 times. So why? To take on the US, something had never been done. It was an Everest. It truly was an Everest. And it was this compelling thing. Someone like Alan, it was more like moving from Alan Bond, who cares, out of Perth, to becoming a global trader as a result of being Mr. America's Cup. So each one, I guess, had their own motivation, but it was this untouchable Everest that, until Hillary came along, no one had ever conquered.
Yes.
And so 74 was your first...
74
was the first time you met Bond, though, for that challenge?
Yes, I just graduated from MIT in Boston with a Master of Science.
And that was partly you knew you just you thought being in America would prepare you better for this too. So as well as doing your thesis, you're also studying the enemy, I think you say in your book.
That's right. Yes, that's exactly right. In hindsight, was it a really clear plan? Oh, gee, it was all part and parcel. And Raza, she was part of that program, And, so Alan Bond, so I just competed in the German Olympics, 4th. Worse than last, a leather medal. Other than mum and the kids, nobody cares.
Yeah.
All that bloody work, and you think, my God, you look back on it, it's just terrible.
It's funny, you're 4th best in the world at something, and you feel like you achieved nothing.
You've let yourself down, you've let your country down, John. You know that.
It is shit.
4th.
It really is, But, and then came back to Australia at Benny Lexcen. Benny Lexcen. He'd changed his name from Bob Miller to
It was
Benny
a legal
Lexcen.
dispute, wasn't it, that he changed his name? Yeah.
And Ben was the name of his dog, and Lexcen was the name of his de facto wife. So Benny was different. But anyway, came back. Alan Bond, 34 years old, technically broke at the time, and he challenged for the America's Cup. You talk about chutzpah. 34 years old, for goodness sake. He reckons that, when he first blew into the office, and I was, I'd just been employed on $92 a week as the assistant designer to Ben Lexcen, for the Southern Cross '74 America's Cup Challenge. And the deal was very, very simple. He bought up 15 kilometres of sand dunes called Yanchep, north of part of, and it was Yanchep Sun City, home of the America's Cup. This is
Yeah, you named it straight away, didn't you?
Sure did. and the dream was, or the ambition was very simple. This is way back in 1973 when I first met him. He said, of course, we'll win the America's Cup. And then we'll go on, and he will host the Olympic Games in the year 2000 at Yanchep. And he believed it.
Yeah. You got one of them, absolutely.
Ultimately, yeah. And I was talking to some people the other day, and Yanchep's thriving metropolis now. Yeah.
So you meet him. What was it like the first meeting with him?
Like a hurricane.
Because you wouldn't have heard much about him. This was before he was really well known, wasn't it?
He's really smart, on his feet. And empowering, there's no question about it. Intimidating, yes. It's all part of, who he was. He was, a man on a mission. Now, did he have a business plan? No. But he could see that if we were able to do this thing, that, again, no nation, no one had ever done over so many, cycles, that it would launch him globally as a business entrepreneur.
Now, that wasn't a great campaign for you in terms of you didn't love the skipper at the time?
Yes, that's right. Correct. He's passed on. Look, it was amateur hour.
Yeah.
And we got hammered yet again. And I said never again, because I just came out of an Olympic campaign, pretty good, fourth, okay. Not bad on the world stage. And going into this thing, it was, it's just another world of unprofessionalism from my perspective.
You thought, from what you said in your book, that there was no team in a sense. It was individuals, and there was no sort of united thing. And you seem to come away with realizing that if we were going to even get close, that amateurism had to go.
It had to be like an Olympic focus, like a military operation, from my perspective, just observing the Americans, the way they went about their business.
Because around this time, this is with Dennis Conner sort of appears a bit.
Yep.
And is part of this, and you're hearing about him around this time. Is this the first time you sort of around '74? You sort of
yes, and then I competed in the '76 Olympics in Canada, and Dennis sailed for the United States in a different class of yacht, Tempest class. I raced the single-handed fin.
Yes,
and I won the bronze as Dennis did in the Tempest class. So we both won bronze, and
so you sort of linked from there.
We
almost.
did, yeah. We had this kind of connection and sailed a little bit with him.
Let's talk. Can we talk a little bit about Dennis Conner here? Because every great story needs a villain, and the villain in this is Dennis Conner. Now, anyone who love him or hate him, everyone acknowledges he was a master sailor. Is that your understanding? Can you speak? Can you give us an insight into your thoughts on this man before we go into the detail of what happened?
Yeah, he was a multiple world champion in the star class, highly competitive Olympic class. He wrote a book called No Excuses to Lose. If you out design, out fundraise, out train the opposition, then there's no excuse to lose. It makes a lot of sense. And that was his, bona fide. Dennis was one of the most Machiavellian operators I've ever come across.
Yes.
Yep. He was super competitive, both on and off the racetrack, in terms of how to kill the opposition.
Yeah. There's no mercy with him.
No. And again, this is the, in the US, or let's say San Diego, you don't do lunch or you don't do dinner. You actually, if you go to lunch, you be careful on your back because you get stabbed. Now, I say that, as a throwaway, and that's not true,
yes.
But regardless, you've got to be careful when you're playing in this game. Okay. And again, that's this whole issue of they are not in the business of losing. They were never in the business of losing.
So did he like playing mind games with you? Was this like, obviously we know what happens on the water, but off the water, from the time he arrived, do you think he was trying to get inside people's heads?
But how to destroy a syndicate financially?
Wow.
How to destroy a syndicate financially? In other words, undermining the funding base. Like we are. This is war.
Yeah,
he's playing the long game. Yeah,
this is war.
So these syndicates that pull together the money to buy and fund these attempts, he would figure out ways to hurt their sponsorship or any way of them being able to actually pull the money. It's like a political campaign where you're trying to stop your opponent fundraising almost.
Well, you just, we can learn plenty from the Pollies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You say one bit about Dennis, which I liked in your book. You said you were watching him, you were sailing with him. He knew you were good, and it was like you were both. He thought he was studying you and working you out, and then it seemed like John was watching him more than he was watching him. You said at some point, you realised at one moment, because you said Dennis did something while he was on the yacht in the race. He did something clever, or he did it well. And you said, I realised at that moment Dennis is a man who has to prove himself to himself all of the time. And he has to have his ego fed, but that only he can really feed it. So he's just he's always trying to outprove himself.
Well, look, I've never met a world champion that's a normal person. You've got to be screwed up and you've got to be different to get out of bed to do extraordinary things.
Yeah.
So Dennis was a world champion. He was very, very good at what he did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so 80s where it becomes, I do like, 1980 you get involved, you get sort of brought back in, but Bond sells it to you as you're going to go over and be the tactician. Was that what he sold it to
Correct,
you as?
Yeah, because I'd won selection for the 1980 Olympic Games.
Yeah.
As Raza, God bless her, reminded me, we took out a second mortgage to fund all this. Again, we're talking about there's no money in this environment. It's just a dream. Anyway, Russia invaded Afghanistan and Australia boycotted the Olympic Games. Certainly the sport of sailing. And Bondi rang up and he said, John, you've got to come over to save the campaign. He's a terrific salesman. full of, it was just wonderful, how you could get sucked in. And anyway, I did a deal, went across, and I was going to be tactician on the boat, which is sort of number 2 on the boat. And I came across, and then, our good friend Ben Lexcen was there, who was the godfather of our first child. Okay, so a very, very close friend. And he busted his wrist. He had plaster cast. And I said, Benny, what's happening? He said, he mumbled something about putting his fist through the wall. Right.
Yeah.
As it turns out, he'd read in the media that I was coming over as tactician, and Benny was tactician. So he actually...
So Bond hadn't told him.
Well, he read about it.
And then you ask him how he did it.
Yeah.
Well, there's a conversation starter.
It was.
For the two of you.
Yeah.
So there's big characters on deck everywhere. I mean, every name you drop or in this particular conversation, whether it's Turner or Bond or Lexcen or you or Connor, these are just giants. They're big personalities who are all coming to the table thinking they're the ones who can get this across the line.
That's right. The Kennedy family.
Yep.
John F. Kennedy, a beautiful speech welcoming the Australians in 1962. I just saw it on YouTube the other day. All these characters, and Ted Kennedy followed our America's Cup in 83, and Jackie was there, and all this stuff,
Yeah, you're the American blue bloods. You're really amongst, aren't you?
Well, we're talking about royalty here.
Yeah.
The American royalty are the Kennedy family.
Yeah. And so 80 doesn't go well, and you see this is quite shambolic. Perhaps we just quickly talk about Ben Lexcen, since brought him up about. You were close to him. Ben Lexcen is the designer, famously, of the wing keel.
Yeah.
He seemed to be. You said at one point it was interesting working with him because he built Australia 2 for you to challenge in 83 when you finally come on board as skipper. But you say almost instantly his mind's on like boats in the future. Like he's almost annoyed that he has to help you get the current boat right because his mind's always thinking about how can we make things better.
Benny, I'll try and sort of paint the picture here. Benny was an orphan. He went to school at 9 and left at 12, so presumably he was untouchable and unteachable, not untouchable, probably both. He was the Leonardo da Vinci of this country, and I've met some really interesting characters globally. Okay, and he was different. He would. One way to describe it is when he was living with the Rives family in Sydney growing up. To wash his clothes, he'd go into the shower and scrub with his clothes on, and then they would slowly dry during the day on him.
I think Mick does something similar.
Look, after a big night, John, That can be the best course of action. But what is this just because he's an unorthodox thinker, or he doesn't approach the world or basic problems like we do?
All of that. He was never taught to think inside of a box. Part of our Western teaching, and I have a double degree and all that stuff, is I remember my professor at MIT saying, John, until you put a problem into numbers, you'll never be able to solve it. Well, working with people like, with Ben, it was just another world of, thinking. It was just out there. Vince Lombardi talked about lateral thinking, and that's Mick, your world of creativity is there's no necessarily bounds, and you go from one idea to another, and
Yep.
Connect the dots and so on, and that's the capacity of the human mind in so many ways. And Benny was unfettered, and he loved to watch birds fly through the air and see how they landed and took off, with no crash landing, and the control system within a wing of a bird. I remember sitting on a sand dunes at Manly in Sydney with Benny, and he said, we're looking at a flock of seagulls, mangy old seagulls, there's millions of them everywhere. He said, John, and there's a lot of wind along the foreshore, so a lot of turbulence. He said, look at these birds, they never crash land, and it's just fantastic. And every takeoff is perfect. He said, look at them when they're coming into land, and next time you guys go down the beach, you have a look through Benny's eyes. He said that you can see the feathers on the upper surface of the wings. They can feel the air slowing down. They trip the wing. They trip the air that goes into so-called turbulence. They drop on the earth perfectly every time. He said there must be 1,000 feathers connected to a brain smaller than a pea. This is in a tiny little in a seagull. And that flight control system, the nerves that effectively connect those feathers into that tiny little brain, that flight control system is more sophisticated than any jet military aircraft known to mankind. So this is the way the man thought, and it was fantastic. Yeah.
And while he's thinking that, watching those seagulls, one of them sneaks up behind him and steals his chip. This is also part of that pea brain's ability to do it. So can I ask, and please tell me if I'm jumping ahead here, but whose idea was it to do the wing keel? Did you guys set him this target, say we need something special from engineering, or did he just turn up one day and goes, guys, sit down, you're not going to believe what I've come up with?
So it goes along the following lines. So there's a lot of discussion, controversy over the years in terms of who designed the wing keel, because the York Yacht Club, and part of the rules was that an Australian, a bona fide national, had to be the designer, the chief designer of the boat.
Yeah.
Okay? And that was, in this case, Ben Lexcen. So he was in the Netherlands ship model testing facility in Holland in 1981, leading into the 1983 America's Cup. This is a cup that we won, right, with Australia too.
Yep.
And he was working on new delta shape, keels, which is conventional shapes of the keels at that era. And he was having a lunch down in the cafeteria of this high tech. One of the most advanced towing tank facilities in the world, and he met some Fokker Friendship design engineers who were working on US submersible, basically torpedo development. And these guys said, what are you doing? And he said, and he was going crazy because he wasn't getting any improvement really in the so-called sweep back of the keel and so on. And he was there for about 5 months, going nuts by himself, just trying to find the next, the big thing. And these guys said, what are you doing? So keel, give it lift, and you need stability. So they said, well, why don't you reverse the taper and then put winglets? And he'd never, at that stage, so we're talking about 1981, the word winglet was a secret terminology. It wasn't bantered around at all.
Right.
So one thing led to another, and he created the wing keel as a result. Now, we see now winglets on most commercial jets, those little tips.
Yeah.
That was all part of it, to smooth out the flow and reduce the so-called induced drag. When you see a plane going through the stratosphere, occasionally you see vapor trails off the tips of the wings.
Yeah.
That's the air going from the one side of the one surface of the air of the wing to the other, spins to such high velocity that it vaporizes and you get the tail tip. So there's massive energy loss of a plane going through the air, massive energy loss of a boat going through the water if you can't smooth it out. there was upsides and downsides to the design. However, Benny then it was Telegram in those days, a long time ago. He said, "We have a breakthrough. We've got to come over." And we were over in England at the time, and Bondi and myself and a few of the other boys went across. The software programs in that era were, very crude. But he said, "We're going to win this fucking race by half an hour." So, oh, Jesus.
But you were sold on the wing keel from the start. You go, I get it. I get the engineering. This is a secret weapon.
No.
Okay.
What point did you start to think that we've got something that could work here with Australia too, that boat?
Well, the interesting thing, we knew that we had something the package was very, very good against the foreign challenges, right? But the interesting thing about this thing called the America's Cup, the first time you actually sail against the defending syndicate is day one of the America's Cup. So you had no idea, no comparison.
Mm.
So it was really interesting in terms of, are we in the ball game or not? Because Australia had already successfully won the selection trials of 3 previous America's Cup challenges, but been blown off the track by the US defence program.
Mm.
At what stage did they send deep sea divers to try and have a look underneath the skirts? Or when it was in the water, did they not send down divers to have a look at the keel?
The answer is yes, they did.
Yeah.
And we caught one lot. So took them to the coppers.
I'm surprised it wasn't Dennis Conner himself.
Yeah.
I have to see this.
Got rid of the film.
So they were that serious. They were really worried.
It was full on, yeah.
Because perhaps we skip to when you're about to show up in America to race, and the build up to this, to those that, I think of certain age, there's no internet.
No.
There's 4 TV channels in Australia, so everyone is following this. Australia's come through, a drought just ended, tough economic times. There's been political turmoil.
Yeah.
Montreal Olympics has not gone well. The 1980s Olympics have been effectively cancelled, or no gold there. We send a very small team. So this is a country sort of starved of sporting success, but also, there's a new prime minister in Bob Hawke. I think he's been in about 9 months when you go over the US.
Yeah.
So for people that don't know, that this became real, something that the nation focused on in a way that I can't think of. We've had the Matildas recently and things, but in the singular focus on this, did you
Kathy
sense
Freeman maybe
Kathy
in
Freeman,
a 400 in the Olympics?
Exactly.
But I can't, in my childhood and my life, I cannot remember her biggest sporting occasion or something that was more, when you get up early and you get out of bed and your family huddle around a TV, I think there is something very special in play to do that. And that was being replicated in every lounge room around Australia at the time.
It's amazing, and it's around the world in so many ways.
Yes.
So the stories we get.
Dennis Conner was on the front cover of Time, I think, at one point, and so it was,
and Australia too was on the front cover of Time.
Yeah,
in America before we raced.
And no pressure.
Yeah.
So when you get there, do you feel this sense? Because the establishment there, the New York Yacht Club, they're not there to help you.
No.
And do you get that sense straight away that?
We were in the cauldron. We were, I use this word war, and I've never been to war. It's nothing like the real thing, but that's how it was. Hail fellow, well met, but that's as far as it goes. With the Yanks, and I respect them, and the education system is very high and highly competitive people, but it was full on. Did we understand the full significance of what was happening back in Australia? Look, no one could have, in their right mind, could have imagined the celebrations that happened in Australia when we won. No one. Like, I met the bloke the other day who was going across Sydney Harbour Bridge. He said that when we crossed the line, the traffic stopped on Sydney Harbour Bridge. People got out of their cars and hugging each other as strangers. Celebrations from what we can see, not dissimilar to the end of World War II.
Yes. Our Prime Minister put a jacket on over the top of another jacket.
Yep.
Probably my most defining image of that day. And we all know declared it an unofficial public holiday.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, people forget we were down in this series, so everyone knows the result. Everyone knows the answer, but we were down. We're on the ropes at one stage in this series.
Yeah, we're 3-1 down. So the Americans only had to win one more race, and that was game over yet again. And we had to win 3 on the trot. That's right. A lot of things.
But you said it was a narrow 3-1 down. Like, you felt that even though you were 3-1 down, you'd had first two races you have gear problems.
Yeah.
And then you feel like, what gave you that? I mean, most people, if you're 132 years, no one has beaten the Americans. You're 3-1 down, but you're thinking, I think this is a close 3-1. I think what gave you that sense that you thought we could actually come back here?
The sense in the team, in the organisation, was a great sense of frustration that we got ourselves into a 3-1 down situation. We felt much better than that. The team felt better as individuals, as a package, as a technology package. We didn't really have any breakages for the whole summer, and then would you believe the first two races of the America's Cup, some stuff broke. It was just crazy. All it did reflect is our maintenance program wasn't up to scratch, and we had to reconfigure our thinking and personnel. But we had situations where we could play the game.
Yeah,
we weren't being blown away by the Yanks at all, and being a 3-1, like, for God's sake, let's just get our act together here. And within any sport, you talk about one step at a time, 1 minute at a time, one game at a time, one day at a time. And it was very, very simple. If we just go out there and do our very best, generate our own personal best, then they'll invite us back tomorrow to play the game yet again.
And so you win the next two, and so and no one's. I don't think there'd ever been a race 6 in the America's Cup, but no one has pushed this far. So you get into, like, it's unknown territory for the Americans. Could you sense the panic in the Americans?
Not panic, no, but it was huge.
Yeah,
you'll love this story. So, first race of the America's Cup. Okay, so this is before we got into 3-all.
Yeah.
Okay, it was 0-0, right? Bob Hawke and Paul Keating were in town. They came over for an international monetary conference in Washington, D.C., and they came down to. Would you
just happened.
They blew into town, okay, with the Australian flag on their wool, Australian wool jumpers.
Right.
Look back and it's ridiculous. Okay. The whole Australian flag emblazoned on their chest. So, but it was colour TV then. It wasn't black and white. And so, we leave the dock, and you couldn't really, the television cameras were there, the helicopters, the fixed-wing aircraft, you couldn't really communicate more than a metre in front.
Right.
You can't simulate, you can't visualise this, even though I used to talk to the team about it. The intensity was just another world. First race of the America's Cup. And so the Prime Minister comes down, and we're about to leave the dock, plus or minus 1 minute of 9 o'clock, okay? Boxing kangaroo flag's about to be brought out. Men at Work down under is about to blare out from our tender, Black Swan, like it's full on.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yes.
And you've got to have, you look at armies over the last 1,000 years, and they go to war with symbols. So we created the boxing kangaroo flag, the red gloves for aggression, the pumped up chest for the pride of a nation, taking on the world. That was part of that was our imaging, and Men at Work Down Under was our battle hymn. Okay, so we're ready to rock. I had no idea about how competitive or not we were going to be, but that was part of the positioning here. Okay, the Prime Minister of the country comes down about 5 minutes to 9 in the morning, and I'm on the stern of the boat, the back of the boat, and he says, and I say, well, what do you say? I said, well, good morning, Mr. Prime Minister. What else do you say? Okay, and he says, John, call me Bob. And he says, what are you going to do? And I said, well, Bob, we'll give it our best shot. He says, bullshit, destroy the bastards. Okay, Hawke was something else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're talking
absolutely.
about seizing the moment.
Yeah. And so that all builds up. It's, going right back from you've done a degree on this, you've done a master's on this, you've lived in America, you've
Watched his great
challenged.
great-granddad.
Your
raced
great-grandmother's.
with
Yeah.
the Lipton go-round.
So
This has been brewing for some time.
Literally brewing since you were a boy. And
Yeah.
and then suddenly it's the last race. It's all tied
Race
up.
7.
Race 7. You know, that must have been, I mean, you said you got used to get nervous. Were you, I mean, the pressure must have just been like nothing you'll ever experience again, surely.
Yeah, that's right. It was a, in a bubble, total bubble. We got rid of all newspapers, television sets out of our crew house. Didn't want to know what the rest of the world. The only people that could get through was my mother, from Australia. It's the only call I'd take.
Yeah.
You don't knock back mum.
Yeah.
No.
And that's it. And basically that was it. And we were in a total bubble. But we understood. Look, I'm guessing a quarter of what was happening back in Australia, but not more.
Not all
It
of
was
it,
huge back here.
Yeah.
Lights going on at 2 a.m, saying, "Wake up, wake up!" Turn your television sets on.
I remember gotten out of bed. Mick would remember.
I want to know what was going on the water. So you're the only person who can really tell us what were from onside on board Australia 2 in race 7.
Yeah.
In your own words, how does this play out?
Well, I guess there's all different angles to it. The Americans were highly competitive that final day. They found a loophole in the rule, able to take a ton of weight out of the boat and add sail area. Now that, how do you figure that?
Right to the very end.
Yeah, but they did. They nailed the weather forecast. It was light.
You knew this was happening,
No.
or you found out later?
We found out while they were doing it.
Oh, while they were,
Yeah,
but it was before the race, so you suddenly
Yes.
realised, they're doing it.
They took a day off, and then we found out what they were doing. And it was legal within the interpretation of the rules, okay? Yet another interpretation. So they came out all, they're highly, highly competitive, very fast. The race, the leadership changed about 7 times during the race, so it was full on. And both boats were highly competitive against each other. So it was, and as a skipper, I maybe have to make 1,000 key decisions in terms of steering the boat and the tactics and working with Huey, my tactician, and Grant Simmer, tactical navigator, and main sheet hand trimmers and so on, like a whole lot of stuff. It was like so what's it like? It's a extremely well-oiled special forces machine. Okay, it's the closest thing I could come to it. And so when we're almost dead out of the race, I think it's so-called the 5th leg, but 4th leg, I guess. Apparently I said we were 57 seconds behind at one stage.
Yeah.
Right? And apparently Chink Longley reminded me the other day that I said words to the effect of, guys, we've got to keep concentrating, otherwise we may lose this race. And we could hardly read their numbers, we're so far behind.
Right.
So the concentration was huge.
Yeah.
That's probably one way to describe it. And looking at the data afterwards, we sailed the boat as close to perfection than we ever sailed the boat before. And we got back in the race. They panicked. Wing keel, they didn't know what they were racing against.
Yeah.
In hindsight, everything's,
And you could sense they were panicking?
Yes.
Yeah,
we could see that. And they were so-called jibing into less breeze, trying to find more breeze. Every time you so-called jibe, make a maneuver like that, you lose about a boat length in distance. So they did 6 or 7 jibes, and all of a sudden we're back in the game. And
is that the equivalent, sort of like they were oversailing the boat or something? Were they doing more?
We were coming at them very, very rapidly, as it turns out. They couldn't see that we had more wind. We were a fair way back.
Right.
Why? Because there's so many spectator boats at the top mark. It was like a washing machine. And we're talking about mini liners here, 200 feet boats. Nothing less than $100 million, in today's dollars.
Yeah.
Massive machines that, all crowded around the top mark. And we came around with more wind. They couldn't see that because the water was so disturbed. And then they so-called jibed away from us to endeavour to find better breeze. And things went pear-shaped for them. And they lost the big lead. That was the point. And we got back.
And you were hunting them. And then you get at what point do you realise that you've got them covered?
I tell you, Mick, only when the gun fired.
Because there was that battle then where you get ahead, but then doesn't Connor attack something like 44 times or something in one leg? Like So it's just when he's
He's not going quietly.
No.
When he's doing that, you have to sort of match him the whole way to make you have to cover him the whole way.
If you can, that's right.
So that must mean that's a lot of extra work and concentration for you guys. The more he's doing, the more you have to respond to.
That's right.
More that can go wrong. Is that what he's trying to do?
Yes, and they got within a boat length of us at one stage. Like, it was really close. Up that final beat to the finishing line. Yeah.
And you're just full concentration? What's in your head? Are you just so busy focused on what you're doing?
We talk about in the zone.
Yeah.
Okay, in the flow of the moment. Within AFL parlance, people like Pendlebury, they have this incredible ability, it would appear, and that's true. They carve time and space out of nothing. And he's not fast. Pendlebury's not fast, but if he does a flick or a twist or whatever, the Dacos boys, what they can do is just remarkable. Well, in their world, it's slow motion. They have time. Their brain works such that even though we're talking about microsecond decisions, they have time. We talk about the flow zone. And way back then, 40 years ago, we didn't have any of this terminology, but it's much more better understood now. So I was in the team, but certainly I, as the skipper of the boat, the captain, I was in my flow zone where things were slow motion. And the decisions coming at me that I had to make, I mentioned whatever it was, 1,000 key decisions. I was able to process them pretty accurately, as it turns out. Yeah.
And Mick and I are obviously, supreme athletes. How physically taxing is?
I can't believe you got a Collingwood mention into the greatest sporting moment in history. I'm very upset.
We can always edit
this.
that out later.
There's the audio bloke's looking through the window. He's laughing too.
He's a Collingwood supporter. They're everywhere. Now, but how physically demanding?
You know what the Collingwood supporters? They're like, you can't kill them off.
Yeah.
Anyway, go on.
They'll be after the nuclear war. They'll still be around. So, how physically demanding is what you're doing in this as well? Because you talk a lot about the mental side, but it's
for the race was 4.5 hours.
Yeah, that's
and I'm skippering the boat.
Yeah,
over that 4.5 hours, decision making physically. Physically it was 4.5 hours, but for the crew, the grinders and so on, it's full on.
Yeah,
to the point of exhaustion. But that's part of the game.
And you get that puff of smoke, bang, you're across the line. What are you thinking?
Mick, at that stage, it was just relief. Relief that we could go home.
Yeah.
We'd got the job done. We'd beaten the bastards. We could go home. And then,
are you frightened at this point of some kind of protest or being beaten in the courts? Or you don't even think about that. You've just achieved a live stream. Yeah.
No, it was relief and then excitement. And then the unbelievable excitement of what we'd achieved. We could then start to process, what had happened here.
Yeah.
After, I'd been at it for 12 years. It was my 4th America's Cup, the 3 losing efforts, all part of the, learning curve in hindsight. MIT, living in the US, all of that stuff. And, but it was this incredible sense of excitement. Now, the question is the parties, how big were they?
Yeah.
Well, for the spectators and the followers, huge. Absolutely huge. For us, not so. We kind of just locked into our own loved ones, our wives and kids and partners and so on, and it was just this supreme sense of relief and pride in what we'd achieved.
Yeah.
And I remember all the colours and the literal skyrockets and television networks, NBC and CBS, all this stuff around me. But it was just this beautiful inner sanctum of people who had achieved something very, very special. And when we got back to the state, when Australia, everyone became ill immediately afterwards. We had no illness for 6 months in America, in Newport. And of course, when the system drops down, you become vulnerable.
Totally.
I was close to pneumonia, as did Raza. And it took me probably 6 months to, go to a so-called dinner party to talk about nothing. And that's what people do at dinner parties. They talk about nothing on the average. And they had no idea what I'd been through or what we'd been through.
Yeah.
It was just it was like coming from Mars. How do you start a conversation? What we'd been through relative to the punter.
It is like coming back to Earth, like for an astronaut or something. It's like...
Well, I think, if you come back, we did, with Swimming Australia, we did quite a lot of work with the Special Forces military. And out of a major conflict, they go into rehab hospitals. They don't go back and party.
Mm.
And we needed to, in hindsight, that was, we'd been to war and back. This thing was full on. Yeah.
Well, it's 40 years later, and we're still talking about it, and we can't get enough of it because that's how much it resonates with our history. And, in a country that loves sport and loves achieving on a global scale, I just can't think of a more important occasion in my lifetime anyway.
Yeah.
So thank you for talking about it. I'm glad it's not just a dinner party that you can't unwrap, but I hope we've got into it in detail enough for you to remember.
Well, the Confederation of Australian Sport voted the Australia 2 victory as the greatest team performance in the last 200 years of Australian sport. Something we're very proud of.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
It should be. We're going to have to let you go. Before we do a little bit of housekeeping, if we could. When you turn on the telly today and you watch the America's Cup and you see catamarans out of the water and guys on bikes instead of grinding and helmets, because if you fall off, you're probably going to die. Did you ever see it ending up here?
All we knew is that in one of the vision of the project is, we're talking about 1983, what will the game look like in the year 2000? Let's get there faster than anyone else in the world, because history tells us, you look at the Olympics and anything, these programs are improving all the time. World records are smashed every 4 years, but any 20-year period just smashed. So we were in the business of endeavoring to get there faster than anyone else. So it became clear, certainly from my perspective, having been in three Olympic campaigns, is that it was you get the technology, it's a race with technology.
Yeah.
But if we could take our blinkers off and then start projecting forward over the horizon. So to endeavour to answer your question, Mick, we had no idea, nor do we have any idea in where we're talking about now.
Yes.
In 20 years' time, what the game will look like. It'll just be much further progressed than what it is now.
Indeed. And the only other thing I wanted to bring up with you is just to remind you, I may have told you this before, but a mutual friend of ours tried to join a yacht club, the Sorrento Yacht Club, and she needed 2 nominees. She got my name and your name. And I still to this day suggest to her that it was my name that got her across the line.
I would have thought
holds a bit more weight.
I would have thought they'd cancel each other's out.